of the means of production, which is left once worker necessary consumption and is paid. So social surplus is that part of the social product which is left once society has put aside what is necessary to reproduce the social output, at least at the present level. And so S can be used safely used for any other purpose. This formula is applicable to all social formations as the core, but I would prefer the term anchor, of historical and institutional analysis. The surplus approach is by definition an open system. It must complete it by historical institutional analysis. As we know, Piero Sraffa and Pierangelo Carignani recovered this approach, submerged and forgotten after the marginalist revolution of the late 19th century. At the heart of the traditional application of the surplus approach to economic history is the idea that civilization, as we understood it, presupposes the existence of a surplus. That is, that only part of the population is needed to produce the subsistence for the whole, for the entire population. So the remaining part of the population, not engaged in the producing subsistence goods, can engage in superior activities like politics, administration and war, religion, culture, science, etc. Different economic formations are then characterized by different modalities of surplus extraction, distribution, and associated institutions. There is, however, some mechanism in this view. There is an antecedent, the surplus, and the consequence, institution, if you like, structure and superstructure in Marxian terms. I will argue in favor of a co-determination of the forms of extraction and distribution of the surplus and the institutions that regulate this process. In this way, Polanyi would meet Sraffa, as we shall see. Anyway, the classical tradition applied the traditional surplus approach, the traditional scheme of the surplus approach since the 18th century, when pre-classical economists related the material base of the economy to its institutions. And also related the appearance of a surplus, consequence of the adoption of agriculture and later of manufacture, to civilization. For instance, Quenet tableau économique is still the best and very lively account of the secular relation between the countryside, where the agricultural surplus was produced, and the town, where it was consumed in superior activities, including the production of handicrafts, luxury goods. In this regard, Max Weber later coined the term consumer city. Marx and Engels, the long tradition of the classical approach in applying this scheme to interpret pre-capitalist economic formations, Marx and Engels went further, looking at institutions as regulating and justifying labor exploitation, and evolving along the forms of the institution would evolve along the forms of exploitation, that is, of the forms in which the elite would appropriate the surplus from the producers. Coming to more recent times, to the 20th century, the greatest economic archaeologist of last century, Vere Gordon Child, a very interesting and funny character, developed this scheme permeating our way of thinking about the transition between prehistory and history. He called Neolithic Revolution the transition from hunter-gatherers societies to an agricultural society. And what followed was the urban revolution, the emergence of appropriation of a surplus by an elite and the birth of cities. So very Gordon Child, he was a Marxist. Really, the way in the 30s and 40s he presented these historical events are still the way we think about prehistory. The Neolithic Revolution followed history then by the Urban Revolution. And the idea that civilization was permitted, the emergence of a surplus in agriculture was the base of what we call civilization, that is the Urban Revolution. The surplus approach has remained quite lively in archaeology. Let me just mention the names of two world-famous archaeologists from La Sapienza in Rome, Mario Liverani and Marcella Frangipane, which is, as many others, use the concept of economic surplus. More controversial is the employment of the concept of surplus in anthropology, especially after the Polanyian critique of the concept that we shall examine in a minute. Anyway, the concept of surplus was adopted by Morgan, the pioneer anthropologist deeply appreciated by Marx and Engels, widely adopted, used by the economic anthropology by Expositores, the American author of the first manual in economic anthropology, who was object of a ferocious criticism by the top neoclassical economist Frank Knight, and eventually, for instance, by Jared Diamond, who applied the concept of surplus quite mechanically, as Friedrich Engels did, and by many present anthropologists. At a closer inspection, we will see Polanyian anthropologists do not refuse the surplus approach as such, but rather its mechanical applications. For instance, anthropologists are particularly interested in the origin of surplus and stratification, the origin of the relation between surplus and stratification. Why and how did we move from relatively affluent and egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies to agriculture? And how did stratification emerge? I mean, we will see things are more complicated than just saying a surplus first, stratification then. I mean, there must be something in between. Anthropologist Marshall Salins is obviously the path-breaking author in this tradition, posing these questions. On the one hand, the Neolithic Revolution obviously had objective causes, say climate changes, population pressure, or the depletion of some free resources. On the other hand, from a social point of view, neither big hunter-gatherers imply per se equality. Form of surplus can be produced even by hunter-gatherers. Nor agriculture mechanically implies producing a surplus and stratification. And even when a surplus is obtained, we do not have necessarily stratification. The surplus can be destroyed and dissipated in community feasting, celebration, as many primitive communities used to do. So, social stratification cannot be considered the mechanical result of the technical possibility to produce a surplus. The question is, given a potential surplus, which institution preserved in some cases equality, and why in other cases institutions emerge supporting inequality? So, there is Sraffian are urged to deal with institutions. A social surplus can be produced but then destroyed, as we said, or collectively consumed, or eventually in various forms appropriated by an elite. But we need historical, institutional, and of course economic and technological analysis to explain how this happened. In this respect, long ago, anthropologist Stephen Goodman argued that in sum, Sraffa presents anthropologists with that which they lack, a way of conceptualizing and calculating production and distribution, but that which they may accept only upon condition of placing it within a set of historical and culturally determined social relationships. To paraphrase the philosopher, this is a method, Raffa, in search of a society. And there are other comment suggestions to Sraffians in this direction. So let me therefore turn to Polanyi, including his criticism of the concept of surplus. What is right in Polanyi, in my view? Polanyians criticized the mechanical uses of the concept of surplus. The key quotation is from Pearson, 1957, in a book edited by Polanyi himself, which is a sort of manifesto of the Polanyian school. The concept of surplus is useful only when the conditions of a specific surplus are institutionally defined. Since there are always and everywhere potential surpluses available, what counts is the institutional means for bringing them to life. And the similar stance we have found in other scholars. More recently, anthropologist Maury Hart argues that studying surplus is incomplete without considering the historical and subjective in a social sense, aspects of surplus, as it is connected to different and overlapping institutional spheres. Institutional Adams has argued that relative surpluses appear simultaneously with the enabling institutions, rules, procedures, and sorties that achieve their realization and distribution. I agree with this argument that it does not make sense to talk of surplus in general as a generic abstraction, but only as a determined abstraction, using Marxist terminology, fully immersed in the historical institutional circumstances that regulate its extraction and distribution. What is wrong in the Polanyian criticism of the concept of social surplus? However, I firmly reject the Polanyian thesis that marginalism is fine when applied to market economies, while it is wrong when applied to pre-capitalist formations, in which economic relations were relatively less important. I mean, the thesis by Polanyi is that general equilibrium theory is fine as far as capitalism is concerned, more or less. But so, neoclassical economists, it's fine that they work on capitalism. But then pre-capitalist societies then are our field. There, marginalism does not apply. A stance similar to Polanyi was also held by a prominent historian of ancient Greece, Moses Finlay, Cambridge historian. I reject the Polanyian thesis for two reasons. Marginalism is wrong also when applied to capitalism, and the economic discipline should not be identified with marginalism. Economic relations were important also in pre-capitalist societies. Polanyian reciprocity and redistribution are both institutional and economic forms of regulation, the production and distribution of the social surplus. Marx was very ironic about the idea that economic categories do not apply to pre-capitalist societies. Marx wrote, is very famous, this much, however, is clear, that the Middle Age could not live on Catholicism, nor the ancient world on politics. I mean, Moses Finlay argued that in Athens they lived out of politics. Come on. On the contrary, it is the mode. Finlay is a great historian. On the contrary, it is the mode in which they gained a livelihood that explains why here politics and their Catholicism played the chief part. Don Quixote long ago paid the penalty for wrongly imagining that knight errantry, an institution, was compatible with all economic forms of society. So there must be an economic base somewhere to institutions. So simplifying, one thing is to say that in pre-capitalist formation, personal political relations matter more than market-mediated relations. That's true. Marx said that. Barry Anderson or Piero Garegnani also argued the same. But another is to conclude that, therefore, economic analysis of ancient formation is irrelevant, what Polanyi and Finlay tend to argue. Moreover, economics does not coincide with markets of general equilibrium theory. Polanyi's criticism of the mechanical view of the surplus approach must, however, be welcome. The origin of the institutional mechanism that transform technical opportunities, that is, potential surpluses, in new social relations of production and distribution is as much important, or even more important, than technology per se. Large-scale irrigation, for instance, requires more. Large-scale irrigation was fundamental in the early civilization in Mesopotamia or in China. For instance, requires more macro-institutional and organizational innovation than strict technical change. If you like, social organizational innovation is a main component of technical change, so to speak. Again, already Marx said that economic change implies a change both in the forces and in the relation of production. By forces of production, Marx implied technology. Relations of production, social relations. So economic change for Marx implied a change of both. They don't not solve questions in Marxism, which is the prime mover. I will not touch upon questions with Marxism. There are a lot of what we are saying has a lot to do with Marx. I mean, my opinion of Polanyi is that Polanyi, like Schumpeter, took a lot from Marx, almost all. With the exception of the best, that is surplus theory. For instance, as already mentioned, the fascinating area of study of the co-determination of surplus and institution have to do with the origin of inequality. Is the hunter-gatherer's egalitarianism a natural fact, as Rousseau thought, or an institutional artificial mechanism? For instance, studies have shown that in primitive societies, emerging of dominant characters in the community are suppressed through making fun of them or physically suppressing them. I mean, egalitarianism is institutionally preserved. And now, as I said, a lot of discussion is, we find a lot of discussion in anthropology, in archaeology. How did the Neolithic population move from potential agricultural surplus to its appropriation by an elite? For instance, to give an example, a widely discussed and important materialist hypothesis is that in Neolithic societies, with the agricultural revolution, storage became systematic and massive, and control of the warehouses by an elite constituted the key step for stratification. In other words, since harvests are typically periodic, storage of the crop, of the product is a necessity. So the very possibility of storing the product for seeding and deferred consumption is a prerequisite of agriculture. Storage also makes it possible to set aside some surplus over normal replacement and subsistence requirements in anticipation of unlucky future events such as famines, floods, etc. These surpluses are referred to in the literature, in the anthropology literature, as normal surpluses. Storage, in turn, implies its social management and defense against potential enemies. Normal surplus may thus constitute an intermediate step, the missing link between agricultural egalitarian society and stratification, because the management of warehouse and normal surpluses may provide priests or personalities who impersonate the function of the community that are put in charge of the management of warehouses, may give these priests or managers of the storehouses the opportunity to transform themselves in a dominant elite. I mean, from management, go to the control of the storage. Let me finally briefly turn to the third approach, new institutional economics. I will be very tentative here since my research is still preliminary. The classical theory has been defined an imperialist discipline for its invading attitude with respect to other social sciences. So they invaded anthropology and, well, much less archaeology, because you have to do field work there. And actually, Polanyians and neoclassical economists fought very tough intellectual battles in the 70s, and 60s, 70s, 80s, under different labels. As far as anthropologists are concerned, substantivists, that is, anthropologists inspired by Polanyi, fought against formalists, marginalist economists who regarded mainstream economics as useful for interpreting primitive and ancient economies. Substantivists thought that the differences between historical economic formation were differences in kind, not in degree. There were substantial difference between the historical economic formations. For the mainstream economists, the differences were just in degree, not in kind. I mean, the final, the eventual result of history is market competition. So all history is an experimentation, a progress towards free markets. In the 70s, 80s, as far as economic historians are concerned, the fight was between primitivists inspired by Finlay, who regarded economic relations as marginal and political relations dominant in ancient societies, versus modernists, the historians inspired by new institutional economics, that regarded ancient societies as potential market economies, but that did not fully develop markets because of information asymmetries and similar stories. So indeed, the two reference points for new institutional economics are methodological individualism and general equilibrium theory. Methodological individualism present humans as ethically neutral, possibly selfish, fighting for individual and their own individual survival and that of the progeny, and in regard social cooperation society appears in this methodological individualistic view as a sort of default strategy. Societies, social cooperation exists as long as it's functional to the individual survival strategy. And the accusation which must be taken seriously, the accusation they move to those who tend to start from society, not from the individual, is that those who start from society should explain how society results from the behavior of its micro components, that is individuals, taking also into account that free riding is pervasive even when cooperation is socially most convenient. So individualism as a behavior is pervasive. Moreover, in new institutional economics, economic and technical change depend on incentives to individual initiative. The second tenet is general equilibrium theory, which show that such a behavior in individualism is consistent with welfare maximization for most, if not for all. Then the main tenet of new institutional economics is that information asymmetries and uncertainty may require formal and informal institutions that regulate and even substitute market exchanges. Let me take the example from Richard Posner, which is a very serious economist, Chicago economist, I believe, working on law and law and economics. In his view, for instance, primitive economies are poor as a result of the poor information available. That is, the existence, the pervasiveness of information asymmetries, transaction cost, absent protection of property rights, etc. Innovation and market are impossible in this situation. But as a result of information asymmetries, there is economic uncertainty severe. So Polanyian non-market institutions based on sharing, reciprocity, or state redistribution may be rational in these historical circumstances. For Posner, for instance, primitive communitarian institutions are sort of social insurance agreement against high uncertainty. Please do not tell Fans or Joe Robinson. At the same time, this institution disincentivate the individual initiative and therefore economic growth, and would create path dependency. In terms of methodological individualism, we would find in this sense a micro foundation of social behavior in an individual advantage. For instance, in this case, risk sharing in a highly uncertain environment. While excellent, I go toward the conclusions. While excellent critical work has been done about general equilibrium theory, Fabio Petri will say something today. Methodological individualism may still be challenging in the sense that it ensures link social analysis to a firm behavioral basis. Individuals strive for their and their progeny survival welfare. Humans are born as individuals, not as social beings. Social cooperation is a default strategy, in a sense accepted by necessity rather than innate, or not. The question, I believe, acknowledged also by the supporters of new institutional economics, is that individuals do not make decisions in a social vacuum. They inherit social beliefs and behaviors or structural constraints which permeate their choices. Inherited structural constraints can be the result of the efficient, likely unconscious choice of early individuals on the best strategy in undoubtedly uncertain historical material circumstances, as Posner, for instance, argues about primitive society. By the way, Posner widely used the concept of economic surplus. So why not? We may accept that, but the question is that in the evolution, more and more individually explained by society, even if in some ideal initial state, we might think in a Hobbesian, from Hobbes, Hobbesian state, initial state, we may think that society results from some sort of social contract, social insurance, as Posner. I mean, the question is that in history, then individuals are explained by society, not the other way around. And then what I find untenable in this author is the strict relation between technical progress and individual incentives. Technical progress is a social, cumulative, incremental process today and even more in primitive ages. How can a learned scholar like Richard Posner reduce the problem of early technical change to a question of lack of individual privacy in primitive society. Some reading of Nathan Rosenberg will be helpful to them here. But let me go. And the second question is the second question in new institutional economics, that they think that they have general equilibrium theory as the benchmark of everything, a sort of general equilibrium theory teleologism. The general equilibrium theory, market economy, is the ultimate destiny of humanity, the final paradise in terms of comparison of early economic formation. I mean, this is it really sounds like the very bad teleologism you find in some very doctrinary Marxism. Here in Marxism, you have the New World, the final revolution as the ultimate destiny, and you have market economy as ultimate. Just short mention of this is Cambridge and an Oxford historian, Shelia Ogilvie, which is very critical of new institutional economics, and they says very clearly that institutions do not existed because they efficiently maximize the economic pie, but because they distribute larger share of a limited pie to elites, with fiscal, military, and regulatory side benefits to rulers and overlords. What she does is to explain institution as mainly as a regulator of the social conflict. Unfortunately, she does not refer to the surplus approach. But let me conclude. In the classical surplus approach, political and legal institutions are mainly related to social power in production and associated distribution issues, as well as to the ideologies of power. In Poland, institutions are mainly related to output distribution issues, restricted to circulation issues in Marxian terms, forgetting the power production issues, as the great Indian economist Krishna Bharadwaj critically pointed out. In new institutional economics, institutions are mainly related to production and trade efficiency. In this capacity, one spoiled of general equilibrium theory teleology, and new institutional economics might be a source of insight in industrial organization issues, although Harry Braverman showed us how even these issues would well depend on questions of social control. New institutional economics neglects power production and distribution issues. In the light of the above, I believe that Sraffa's and Polanyi's teaching can be useful merged by saying that institutions do exist in order to regulate the extraction and distribution of the social surplus. This mainly concerns political and legal institutions, but also cultural and industrial organization. There is a lesson here for Sraffians. The analysis of the historical ways in which the social surplus is extracted and distributed is not independent of institutional analysis, not just as a lip service, I mean. There is a lesson here for Polanyians. The analysis of the historical ways in which the social surplus is extracted and distributed is the necessary material answer of institutional analysis. While the present approach reminds of Marx's historical materialism, I leave to another occasion the severe problem with the Marxist theory of modes of production. Finally, I see only a residual role to insights from new institutional economics, but my criticism is still preliminary in this regard. Okay, thank you very much. I think I finished. Is somebody there?
Okay. Oh, so, Sergio, thank you very much for a present. Now you hear me, Sergio? It's okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, you respect perfectly your time, so you're right in time. Thank you very much for the presentation and to respecting the time. So after, the question that the points that Fabio will raise after the two presentations. Okay, so you wait and the questions for both presentations after Professor Petri presentation that begins now. Professor Petri, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Thank you very much here. Yes, we hear it.
Something has happened to my computer, which has disconnected my camera. So you cannot see my face. But I think I can, nonetheless.
Professor, we see your presentation here. It's okay.
Yes. So yes. I must simply go to my presentation. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much.
And start it. Okay. Can I go on? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Sorry.
Perfect. You can... Okay. So, first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's an honor. And I will try to give you a feeling of the general ideas which are behind my big microeconomics textbook that explain, as Professor Pinkusfeld said, the rather strong criticism advanced in that book against the neoclassical approach. And I think that what comes out of the advances in capital theory has important implications for the theories of distribution, employment, and growth, and can allow a more civilized guide of capitalism. I will try to explain why the issues, not always very clearly discussed, but nonetheless discussed in the Cambridge debates on capital theory, are very important. And precisely for this reason are not discussed by the mainstream, because an honest discussion would endanger the neoclassical picture of capitalism, which is very important for conservative thought and the status quo. The point is that capital theory allows discriminating between the two main competing approaches on how a capitalism functions, which are the classical or surplus approach and the neoclassical or marginal approach. The classical surplus approach must be combined with non-neoclassical approach to employment, as suggested by Keynes and also Kalecki, as determined by autonomous aggregate demand and multiplier. And in this approach, wages, as you will know, are determined by social political forces. One can cite class conflict, unemployment, laws. These are very important. The political party in power, the internal divisions of the working class, which is not too often stressed in general theory, but it is very important in applications. The dominant ideology, which is very importantly influenced by whether one thinks that it is the classical or the neoclassical approach the correct one, and by economic policy. Importantly, there is no decreasing demand curve for labor in this approach. Profits are due not to a contribution of capitalists, but only to their superior bargaining power. And we have an analogy with feudalism. The control of the means of production by the ruling class, control of land in feudalism, of capital in capitalism, excludes workers from autonomously being able to produce their subsistence. So workers are obliged to accept to work for capitalists and to renounce part of what they produce in order to obtain subsistence. Hence, one can legitimately talk of exploitation. The situation is not so different from that of slaves or of the serfs under feudalism. And unemployment, of course, is used to reduce the bargaining power of labor. It is determined by aggregate demand in this classical surplus approach combined with Keynesian Kaleckian determination of aggregate demand and employment. Coming to the marginal or neoclassical approach, you probably know about it. Let me just remember very briefly how this approach derives decreasing demand curves for factors. Let's start from the simplest example, an economy where only one good, corn, is produced with labor and with corn itself as an input, as capital. So in this economy, you would have a given endowment of capital corn, a given quantity of labor, but supposing that the capital corn is fully employed, you can derive in the economy-wide a curve of the marginal product of labor. Now, the theory argues that firms will demand labor until the wage becomes equal to the marginal product of labor, and so the curve of the marginal product of labor, which is a decreasing one, becomes the demand curve for labor. And then you have that if the wage goes up, the demand for labor decreases. If wage goes down, the demand for labor increases. And this gives a presumption of stability, of equilibrium in the labor market, because if there is unemployment and if wages then decrease, the employment of labor will increase, and this will bring to the full employment of labor. By the way, it can be shown if one factor earns its marginal product, the residue, which is going to the other factor, in this case, corn capital, is its marginal product. So capital too earns its marginal product. In this very simple economy, the reason why you can have a decreasing demand curve for labor is simply the choice of firms about how much labor to combine with the capital they have. But there is also another substitution mechanism based on consumer choice. If wages goes down, and if the economy is producing a variety of consumption goods, then the consumption goods which use lots of labor and relative to capital become cheaper relative to the ones which use little labor relative to capital in their production, because of course the weight of wages is greater in the cost of the goods produced with lots of labor relative to capital. So the goods produced with high percentage of labor relative to capital become cheaper. The argument then is consumers shift the composition of their demand in favor of those goods which have become cheaper. So the industries producing those goods expand, while the other industries contract. They must contract because we're assuming the full employment of capital. So if one industry expands, some other industry must contract. But the result is that units of capital are transferred from the production of goods which use little labor to the production of goods in the industries which use lots of labor per unit of capital. So overall, the demand for labor increases. And so this is another reason why when wages decrease, the demand for labor increases. So the same argument, it is argued, can be used also for capital and for land. The argument is this theory can be generalized to any number of factors. So we have a decreasing demand curve for each factor. And so for each market of a factor, we can assume a tendency to the full employment of that factor. And so the equilibrium is stable. This theory was apparently very plausible because the decreasing demand for curves for factors were derived simply from the indubitable existence of technical choice and of consumer choice. This is the reason why, as we saw in the previous talk by Professor Cesaratto, Polanyi and lots of other people, in fact, were unable to escape from this kind of reasoning and from the idea that there are marginal products and then there are markets which are stable and so on and so forth. Apparently, this theory was making a clear step forward relative to the classics who had not realized that there were these substitution mechanisms. Interestingly, it's very difficult to argue that labor is exploited if one accepts this theory. Why? Well, because each worker receives a wage which is equal to its marginal product. But the marginal product is precisely the contribution of that labor to social production, because it is what society would lose if that laborer decided not to work. So it's very easy to argue that each worker is contributing its marginal product, is receiving his marginal product, so contribution equals pay. And the same, it is argued, can be held also for all factors and also for capital. Capitalists contribute to production by saving increasing the stock of capital, and the act of saving is repaid for the marginal product of the capital that the saving creates, and so capitalists too receive as much as they deserve because it's equal to what each act of saving is contributing to society. For time reason, I will skip some further considerations on exploitation. Let me only stress how much this general ideology has contributed to the rich feeling that they deserve to be rich, and therefore being very angry when they are taxed, because they think that what they're earning is precisely what they're contributing to society, and then it is unfair to deprive them of what they're contributing. Now, which approach is correct? The results of capital theory suggest that the classical approach does not suffer from the central weakness of which it was historically accused, its inability to determine the rate of profits. On the contrary, the marginal neoclassical approach comes out to be theoretically indefensible. Let me briefly remember the classical difficulty. The rate of profits requires determining the normal or natural prices. The rate of profit is a notion which refers to the normal returns on investing your capital, and so it requires determining normal prices. Why it requires that? Because the profit that a firm makes is its revenue from selling the product minus its costs. Now, both the revenue and the costs depend on prices. Even if, as the classical approach does, you take the real wages given, there are the prices of goods, both of the products and of the inputs utilized to produce. So unless we can determine these prices, we do not know the profits. And so we do not know the rate of profit, which is the ratio of profits to the value of advanced capital. Now, prices depend on the rate of profit. And the simplest example is the following. Suppose there are two goods, A and B, both produced by 1 unit of labor, with wage advanced 1 period for good A, but advanced for 2 periods for good B. Then prices must satisfy these conditions. The price of good A must equal the wage, remember 1 unit of labor, so 1 wage, but with the rate of profit on top of it, because one will only produce if one can obtain the rate of profit on it. So, for example, 20%, the wage must be increased by 20%. Good B will have to cover the wage plus the rate of profit over 2 periods. So must be multiplied by 1 plus R to the square power. So the ratio between these two prices is equal to 1 plus R, i.e. depends on the rate of profit. So relative prices, which is what we need to determine the rate of profits, because we need price of output relative to price of anticipated capital. If we double both, nothing changes in the rate of profit. So we only need the relative prices, but these relative prices depend on the rate of profit. So there seems to be a danger of a vicious circle. We cannot determine the rate of profit unless we have the prices, and we cannot determine the prices unless we have the rate of profit. And this is the accusation moved by Jevons, Valras, and others against the classicals, against Ricardo, and also later against Marx. But it has been shown by Dmitriev, Borkiewicz, Seaton, Zrafa, and then others that this vicious circle is not there. The given real wage does allow a simultaneous determination of normal prices and rate of profit. So let me show this in the simplest case. There are enough equations for simultaneous determination of all normal prices and of the rate of profit. So suppose two goods. You have here the two equations which say that good 1 must cover the costs of the inputs. A11 and A21 are the quantities of goods 1 and 2 employed per unit of output, assuming circulating capital like seed, corn, i.e. capital goods which last for only 1 period, and assuming production cycles which last 1 year. So 1 plus R is what one must multiply by the price of the utilized inputs. And then one must add the wage. AL1 will be the quantity of labor used per unit of output of good 1, multiplied by the wage, And here I'm assuming the wage is paid at the end of this year, so there's no rate of profit on it. The same holds for good 2. And then we need something fixing the good in terms of which we measure the wage. Here I assume it's good 1, and the wage is given. So we have 3 equations to determine 4 unknowns, which are P1, P2, R, and W, but W is taken as given by the surplus approach, Marx would say, determined by class struggle. So the classical difficulty is not there. And we can soon go back to the classical approach. And there is no problem in generalizing to more goods, and the theory can also be extended to choice of technique. For each additional good, there is one additional price equation, so always only one degree of freedom, closed by the given real wage. Interestingly, equations equivalent to these ones, which are essentially the Sraffian ones, are also found in Walras, and equivalent equations also in Wicksell. But their implications for the classical approach were not grasped before the rediscovery of the surplus approach by Sraffa and then explained further by Garegnani. Then let's see the problems of the neoclassical theory, which come out to be insurmountable. By the way, the problems connected with capital are not the only ones of the neoclassical approach. There are also problems with non-uniqueness, instability, etc., of equilibria, but I will leave these further problems aside to concentrate on the problems connected with capital, which are anyway decisive. One can talk of supply-side problems and of demand-side problems connected with capital. On the supply-side problem, the easiest problem to perceive is a problem concerning the determination of the data of a neoclassical equilibrium. The equilibrium requires for its determination a certain number of consumers with given preferences, the knowledge of certain ways of producing goods, the techniques, and the given endowments of factors. The problem raised by capital is with specifying the endowment of capital. To understand this problem, one must first of all understand the logic of the traditional marginal approach. Why do I stress traditional? Because we will see that recent general equilibrium, i.e. the recent versions of the marginal or neoclassical approach, have changed on this, have changed very importantly, and it has created new problems. So we have to distinguish. But the traditional marginal approach conceived the equilibrium to be a center of gravitation of time-consuming adjustments. And this implied that the data of equilibrium had to be sufficiently persistent for the deviations from equilibrium to be corrected or compensated, so that equilibrium was able to indicate the averages and with its changes, the trends. This is the same idea that, restricted to prices, one finds, for example, in Adam Smith or Ricardo or even Marx, that prices, market prices, oscillate around certain normal values, which Smith called natural prices, and these natural prices had to be determined by conditions sufficiently persistent to allow them to remain there while market prices oscillated around them, so that this natural price indicated the average, the trend of market prices. Because of this element, the equilibrium of traditional marginalist approach is called a long period equilibrium with Marshall's terminology, because it has the condition that each industry is in long period Marshallian equilibrium, i.e. price equals average cost inclusive of the normal rate of interest, which, if we leave for simplicity risk aside, we can identify it with the rate of return of capital on rate or rate of profit. And so the prices which the traditional equilibria wanted to determine were long period normal prices, the analogous in their role to Smith's natural prices. The very important implication of all this is that the quantities in existence of most capital goods, except perhaps nuclear plants can change quickly. So cannot be given data in the determination of the equilibrium. They would change during the adjustments that should bring the economy towards equilibrium. So they cannot be taken as given, these quantities. They must be determined endogenously by the equilibrium itself. How did the neoclassicals traditionally reconcile this idea that the amounts of the single capital goods cannot be given, and yet the equilibrium can be determined? The reconciliation was through the idea that the several capital goods were simply transitional embodiments of quantities of the single factor capital. They did not assume that there really was a single capital good, nor that output could be treated as a single good. They were not at all assuming an aggregate production function. They were assuming an economy with many goods. But the capital goods were conceived as embodiments of a single factor capital, whose form could change and could become adapted to the firm's requirements. So the given quantity of this total factor capital was putting a constraint on the quantities of the single capital goods. You could have more of some capital goods, but only if you had less of other capital goods. And this allowed the determination of the quantities of single capital goods to be performed. They had to be the ones required for the tendency of the rate of return on capital to become the same everywhere, but satisfying the condition that in total they had to embody only the given quantity of capital. This given quantity of capital could be treated as not changing except slowly because of net savings, but anyways, as slowly as, for example, the supply of labor. So it could be treated as given. So it was a given persistent quantity, and this allowed determining a sufficiently persistent equilibrium, disaggregated, I repeat, not a one good like in solo growth model. But then there is the problem. If you have this conception of capital as a capital of variable form, how is it measured? What does it consist of? Well, it can be shown that it must be necessarily measured as a quantity of exchange value. Why? Well, this is the reasoning. I hope I can make it clear without taking too much time. Any factor, all units of this factor in equilibrium tend to earn the same unit rental. Thus, take two lands, A and B, of the same quality but of a different surface, and suppose land A earns as total rent twice as much as land B. We can immediately conclude land A must have a surface twice as large as land B. Otherwise, it could not be earning twice as much as land B because they have the same quality. Now apply this same reasoning to two capital goods. So suppose you have two different capital goods A and B. Capital good A earns as net rental, after you reintegrate the consumption of capital good, twice as much as capital good B, suppose. Now we want to see this as due to the productive contribution of a common factor capital embodied in them. What a capital good earns depends on how much of this factor capital is inside this capital good. Now, this then implies, since capital good A is earning twice as much as B, that A must contain twice as many units of capital as B. This seems very clear, isn't it? But now we come to the important part. The net rental on capital goods is the interest on the value of capital. And the rate of interest, or leaving aside for simplicity risk, the rate of profit is uniform, tendentially at least uniform. So the normal value of capital good A must be twice the normal value of capital good B. So this means that the quantity of this hypothetical factor capital embodied in the different capital goods is necessarily proportional to the value of those capital goods. Hence, the value of capital goods measures the quantity of capital. Nor is there any other physical way to specify this quantity. weight or volume of capital goods, have no univocal connection with productivity or earnings. So we obtain a problem. The capital endowment, let's call it K, of an economy, is the value of the capital goods present in it. But so we could observe an economy and take the value of the capital goods in it and say, okay, this is the capital of this economy. But do we have the right to take it as given to determine the equilibrium? The equilibrium is not what the economy is in. Suppose, for example, there is immigration, the equilibrium would have to be reached, corresponding to a greater employment of labor. But then, could we take that observed value of capital as the value of capital to be included among the data of this equilibrium which must be reached? No, because prices will change, quantities of capital goods will change, and we do not know how. So this number K that we have observed should help determine equilibrium prices and capital composition of the equilibrium, but cannot be taken as given before these are determined. Note, for example, that even an unchanged physical composition would change in value with R. We have seen indeed that relative prices change when the rate of profit changes. So, note, this was realized by neoclassical economists after the initial enthusiasm with their theory. For example, Wicksell wrote, but it would clearly be meaningless, if not altogether inconceivable, to maintain that the amount of capital is already fixed before equilibrium between production and consumption has been achieved. Whether expressed in terms of one or the other, a change in the relative exchange value of two commodities would give rise to a change in the value of capital. So, until we know the rate of profit, we do not know the relative exchange value of two commodities, but until we know that relative exchange value, we do not know the rate of profit or interest. And indeed, a few lines later, Wicksell admits this implies an indeterminateness of the endowment of capital. But then a theory which leaves necessarily indeterminate the endowment of one of its factors is a theory which doesn't hold water. It's a wrong theory, clearly. Now, this is noticed especially by Lindahl, Hayek, and Hicks, three economists who, especially Lindahl, who was a pupil of Wicksell, and Hayek, who studied Wicksell in German translation, realized this problem, thinking precisely on Wicksell. And so they decided that they had to give up this value factor capital. They attempted to surmount it by taking as given the endowment of each capital good. And this meant a shift to a very short period, modern general equilibrium. And the modern forms taken by this are the intertemporal or the temporary equilibria. Now temporary equilibria have been abandoned. The idea was that perhaps we can have supply and demand work on the basis of given endowments of each capital good. So perhaps we can save supply and demand as the theory determining income distribution, although we have to drop something of the old theory. What? The idea of equilibrium as a center of gravitation of time-consuming adjustments. Because now the adjustments, if they take time, and they do take time, will change the amounts of capital goods. So we have a series of new problems. The first one, impermanence problem, is the one I just mentioned. Adjustments take time. During this equilibrium, the endowments of capital goods and expectations change. So the equilibrium itself, defined on the basis of given quantities of each capital good, is changed by this equilibrium. And this implies that we do not know where the economy goes. I mean, this equilibrium changes equilibrium. Next period, we do no longer have the equilibrium we might have had if equilibrium had been reached instantaneously in the first period. But then again, equilibrium will not be reached instantaneously. So period after period, the economy is not going to equilibrium, and we simply do not know where it's going. The remedy was to assume instantaneous adjustments, the so-called famous auctioneer. But is that a remedy? It simply means, okay, let's assume we can eliminate this problem. It's just a decision not to face the problem. And so it is nonsense as a remedy, because these equilibria in reality are obvious. We do see unemployment, we do see firms regretting what they've decided to produce, and so on and so forth. But it's not the only problem. There is also another problem, which I call the price change problem. Because the initial endowments of the several capital goods in these kinds of equilibria are given, they are going to change. If there is too much of a capital good, it will not be produced. If there's too little of capital goods, there will be special efforts to produce more of it. Then we cannot assume agents to ignore this fact. Agents know the prices are going to change because the quantities of these capital goods are going to change. So we must assume that they know what prices will be in the future in order to take their decisions at the initial period. And this, we can assume that they have expectations about these future prices, but expectations are unknowable, and also they change. They change during this equilibrium, and they change from one period to the next, so we do not know how they will change. So, another remedy. Let's suppose that we have already, in the initial period, markets for the future goods. We have so-called complete markets. People decide not only what to exchange today, but also what to exchange in the future. Except there is a problem. Future markets are impossible because we cannot explain, we cannot know what people will demand in the future for goods, because future consumers have not been born yet. So we do not know what they will decide. So, further remedy, okay, we cannot have complete futures markets already existing in the initial period. Let's assume perfect or correct foresight, which is, of course, total nonsense. And there is a logical point which clearly shows why it's nonsense. Because there are, in reality, novelties, i.e., new things which could not be predicted. One clear example, scientific new discoveries, new theories. How can we predict them? But if we cannot predict every possible future, and we cannot predict future knowledge, then we cannot coordinate ex ante the actions of agents. I'll try to be clearer. The theory admits that we do not really know what's going to happen. There can be an earthquake or there may be no earthquake. But the theory says for each possible future event, people know it could happen, attribute a probability to it, and behave on the basis of these probabilities. But this is not enough, because there are things which simply cannot be known to be possible. No one could predict general relativity before Einstein discovered it. So it is impossible to know all possible future events. Therefore, this impossibility of coordinating ex ante the actions of people is there. Therefore, intertemporal equilibria cannot be determined at all. Intertemporal equilibria are a myth. There are no intertemporal equilibria, which is, after all, obvious. I mean, this future cannot be predicted. There is also another problem, too little substitutability. On this, I skip because of lack of time. Very briefly, take an assembly line. If you want to change the amount of labor you use per unit of output, you have to change the entire assembly line. So the idea that you can change how much labor you use to produce a certain output requires that you can change the capital goods with which labor is combined. But this is not possible if you are in these kinds of equilibria where the capital goods are given and you cannot change them. You cannot use capital goods which have not been produced yet and which are the ones best adapted to a new wage. And in fact, there is still another problem. These equilibria all assume the full employment of labor, and this means that aggregate demand equals the value of output at full employment, and this means savings are absorbed by investment. But how is this justified? Well, it is simply not justified, and I will talk about this a little more later. Even leaving aside this last problem, that there is no justification for the full employment assumption, the other three difficulties, impermanence problem, price change problem, substitutability problem, suffice to imply that these neo-Varrasian equilibria tell us nothing at all about actual economies. These neo-Varrasian equilibria simply do not know how the economy behaves in disequilibrium. And the auctioneer, of course, is only a fairy tale. So, a reference to these equilibria as rigorous macro foundations for more applied theories, for example, macro theory, is only a smokescreen. And indeed, it can be shown that what is really operating there is a persisting faith in the old marginalist adjustments. For example, in this paper of mine, a recent paper in Review of Political Economy, I show that Malenvaux or Bliss or Stiglitz continue to believe that if wages go down, employment increases. On what basis? They can only conclude it if they believe in the old capital stock. Because if they refer to, for example, Arre de Breu, when wages go down, the quantities of capital goods or the single capital goods will change, because they do admit that adjustments are not instantaneous. So how can they continue to believe that wage decreases increase employment? Only because down below, they go on believing in capital, in the old way, capital, the old factor, which behaves as a single factor in spite of being, in fact, an amount of exchange value. So, in fact, neoclassical theory, in spite of all its pretensions, of all its very complicated models with intertemporal optimization and lots of complications, imperfect competition, etc., are in fact at bottom the solo model with some modifications, and this can be accepted only if the economy gravitates towards a solo growth path, and this can only be defended on the basis of the old adjustments: tendency to full employment of labor, tendency of investment to adjust to savings, and this requires capital-labor substitution as conceived with the old notion of capital. So we cannot believe in the old adjustments. Let me show this, for example, for the labor demand curve. The demand curve for a factor requires the full employment of the other factors. The quantities employed of the other factors are given, and we change the amount employed of our first factor, and we determine its marginal product. So the labor demand curve requires the full employment of the endowment of capital. But how are we going to specify this endowment of capital? We cannot determine it as a given quantity of value, because it is impossible as admitted by Wicksell. And we cannot determine it as a given vector of capital goods, because the quantities of capital goods change during the adjustments caused by a change in the wage. And any change in the wage, for example, think of immigration, it will take a long time. Firms must decide how much to produce with the new quantities of labor. Wages must change. Firms must change their technical combinations. It takes time, months, perhaps even years. And during this time, the quantities of capital goods change. So we cannot take the vector of capital goods as given. So labor demand curve cannot be determined. This seems radical. They teach us this notion from the very first textbook in economics. We have it somehow within ourselves now. We tend to believe if the wage goes down, employment increases, but we have no reason to believe in it. One first consequence: without a labor demand curve, there is no cross between labor demand and labor supply. So there is no equilibrium real wage. And so a different theory of wages is indispensable. Second implication, there is no foundation for the thesis that in order to increase employment, real wages must decrease. Of course, I'm talking to people in Brazil and in the whole South America. The main problems are connected with the open economy. That's a different problem. I'm not particularly competent in this, so I will not say anything on it except this. If what is wanted is more international competitiveness, why should be wages to decrease rather than other incomes? But on this, I leave the topic, which is complicated. But definitely there is a whole Keynesian tradition, which is very reasonable and must be recuperated on this, getting rid of the neoclassical elements surviving in Keynesian analyses. Then, what determines labor employment? It is aggregate demand, of course. Autonomous demand plus the Keynesian multiplier. And then it's clear wage decreases can reduce aggregate demand because wage decreases means less consumption. And so you see here clearly that we simply cannot have clear ideas about the effects of wage changes. One has to study case by case. It can depend on the situation. This was connected with the supply side problem. Now let's see the demand side problem with this traditional conception of the several capital goods as embodying a quantity of a single factor capital. It has come out, again, due to Sraffa, that even conceding that one can treat value of capital goods as somehow representing the quantity of capital, still capital labor substitution is not well behaved. And this has destructive implications for neoclassical investment theory and macroeconomics. The point is that neoclassical theory, in order to argue the tendency toward full employment, must argue that investment adjusts to full employment savings. Otherwise, the decreasing demand for factors will not work. Let's see why. Assume labor unemployment. Assume wages decrease. Suppose firms then hire more workers. Then production increases. So incomes, total incomes, increase, and then savings increase. In order to sell the increased production without losses, aggregate demand must increase, in particular investment must increase as much as savings have increased. So the increase of labor demand and of output caused by the lower wages, according to the neoclassical approach, needs that aggregate demand increases, i.e. that investment increases as much as savings, or that increase in output will come out to have been mistaken and would be undone. Workers will be fired back. Now, how do the neoclassicals answer this necessity for increases in investment? By arguing that the increased savings cause decreases of the rate of interest, and this causes increases of investment. And the explanation is that investment is the value of purchases of capital goods by firms aiming to reach the desired stock of capital. When the rate of interest decreases, the desired stock of capital increases because capital behaves like any other factor in spite of being an amount of value, according to the neoclassicals. Therefore, the desired capital labor ratio, indicated as K over L, rises, so investment increases. There is a first problem with this argument, not noticed until rather recently. It needs a given labor employment, the full employment of labor in practice. Otherwise, the rate of interest, what it can determine is the desired ratio of capital to labor. But an increased desired ratio of capital to labor means an increased desired capital only if the denominator, L, is given. So, in fact, the use of the investment function derived from the capital demand function in the ISLM model, for example, is illegitimate, because in the ISLM model, labor employment is not given. So in fact, it comes out that without the already assumed full employment of labor, investment is not a decreasing function of the interest rate. It can be anything. It can be determined by demand, for example. But this problem has not been really absorbed yet. It's a recent notation by me, I must admit. So let's turn to the problem more specifically connected with the Sraffian results. A lower rate of interest implies a higher ratio of capital to labor only if capital can be treated as a factor analogous to land or labor. But capital is in fact a value factor, and prices change with distribution. So there is no guarantee that this amount of value capital behaves like technical factors. And in fact, it does not, as shown by Sraffa. Now, Sraffa has shown something which is based on the following observation. Suppose that capital behaved like a technical factor, like land. Then take two goods which are produced with labor and capital in different proportions. One of two goods is more capital intensive, uses more capital per unit of labor. Let the rate of interest or rate of profit increase. What will happen to the prices of these goods? Well, clearly, is the rate of profit goes up, the relative price of the good which uses more capital per unit of labor will go up relative to the other good. Because amount of capital, amount of labor are given, so we increase the rate of profit, and this will cause a greater increase in cost in the good produced with more capital. So the good produced with the higher K to L ratio necessarily becomes relatively more expensive when the rate of profit increases. Sraffa has shown that this is not what necessarily happens. I'll show the next slide what happens, what can happen. As Sraffa comments, the reversals in the direction of the movement of relative prices in the face of unchanged methods of production cannot be reconciled with any notion of capital as a measurable quantity independent of distribution and prices. So let me repeat. If capital behaved like land, then we should observe, as for production of two goods with only land and labor, that when the land price goes up, the direction of the change in the relative prices of two goods is always in one direction. Always monotonically, the good which uses more land relative to labor increases in price relative to the good which uses less land. If capital were like land, we should observe the same, and we do not. We observe, for example, this is one example due to Sraffa, that the difference between these two goods, the price of these two goods A and B, as the rate of profit increases, can first increase the difference. It means good A is becoming more expensive relative to good B, but then starts decreasing, and then starts increasing again. So it would seem that in the beginning, good A is more capital intensive, is the one which uses more capital. But then in the part where the curve is decreasing, good A has become less capital intensive. The increase in the rate of profit makes it decrease in price relative to the other good. And then it starts again increasing. So this means there is no way of treating capital as something which is a quantity given of a factor. Now, there has been another example by Samuelson, which is very similar and shows a phenomenon which has been called re-switching. Here we have two goods, on the vertical axis, the relative price of these two goods. Now it's the relative price, not the difference in the price. And we have R increase. And we observe that the relative price of good A relative to good B first increases and then decreases. and it crosses twice the level at which the two prices cost the same, so that the relative price is 1. Now, this is for two different goods. But suppose that these are not two different goods, but it's the same good produced with two different methods. Then this will allow us to choose which method must be adopted. The method which allows selling the good at a lower price. So in the first stretch of this figure, where the rate of profit R is low, it's good A that costs less than good B, so the method corresponding to good A would be chosen to produce this good. But at a certain point, good A becomes more expensive than good B, so it's the other method, the method B, which becomes preferred. But then things change again, and the method corresponding to A becomes again the preferred. So the economy in choosing techniques would go back to choosing a method of producing the good which had been previously abandoned. And this again is impossible if capital were like land, a physical quantity of a good. So this confirms that there is no way of conceiving capital as a factor. Implication. Since, as this has proved, no logically satisfactory definition of capital as a factor of production is possible, then this factor capital simply does not exist. But for a non-existent factor, it's impossible to talk of a demand curve, nor of an endowment. We cannot talk of a demand curve for a factor that doesn't exist, nor of a given endowment for a factor that doesn't exist. Note, this argument holds independently of the empirical likelihood of these phenomena shown as possible by Sraffa and by Samuelson. The fact that we have no given endowment of non-existent factor capital implies that it is confirmed that it is impossible to determine a long-period labor demand curve. The fact that there is no demand curve for capital implies that we have no right to derive an interest-elastic investment function, even assuming that labor employment is given. And indeed, the possibility of reverse capital deepening, i.e. that the value of capital per unit of labor changes in very strange ways when we change the rate of interest, confirms the absence of any right to such an assumption of an interest-elastic investment function, even which refers to the conception of capital as an amount of value. So let me clearer. This result of the possibility of reswitching means there is no way of conceiving capital as somehow a single factor. We have already criticized the possibility of measuring it an amount of value as logically circular. But what it shows, in addition, reswitching, is that there is no other possible way of conceiving the several capital goods as representing amounts of a single factor. Now here, on the right-hand side, you have a graph which shows one possible behavior of the value of capital per unit of labor as the rate of profit R changes. It's derived from the left-hand graph, but now for time reason I will not explain why, but it can have the shape shown on the right-hand graph. Now you will agree this has no connection at all with any reasonable conception of a decreasing demand curve for value capital as R changes. So no reason at all to argue that investment, the value of capital goods decided by firms, will become greater if the rate of interest decreases. So no reason to believe that the rate of interest can bring investment to adjust to full employment savings. Interestingly, we can conclude that the victory of monetarism in the debate on Keynesian economics was based on a false theory of investment. I can add that moderate general equilibrium theory and its supposed applications in macro like dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models simply assume that investment adapts to full employment savings with no justification. They cannot use the old traditional capital-labor substitution because they have been chosen precisely to avoid the single-factor capital, so they have no right to have recourse to the old reasonings, which, by the way, which besides would require time-consuming adjustments, which these models cannot accept. Modern general equilibrium theory cannot accept time-consuming adjustments. So that investment adapts to full employment savings is simply taken for granted. If you go and ask neoclassical economists, they probably will say, well, but it's clear, investment is decreasing function of rate, and why? And then they will stop if they remember they've just said we have to turn to modern general equilibrium models because capital as a single factor is indefensible. A brief observation, since we haven't really exhausted our 2 hours, allow me 3 more minutes. The attempts to argue, as for example Professor Sheffield has been doing for a number of years now, a low probability of reswitching are, I would argue, radically misconceived. The possibility of reswitching suffices to show the illegitimacy of all arguments based on treating capital as a single factor of production of variable form. So let me put the argument in this slightly different way. This treatment of capital as a single factor excludes reswitching. The latter, on the contrary, is perfectly possible. Then we are in a situation, as I say at the end of this, analogous to that of Newtonian physics. The Newtonian image of the world before Einstein did not admit that light rays, by passing next to the sun, could be bent by the mass of the sun. On the contrary, this has been shown to happen. What this means is that Newtonian physics must be abandoned, and in fact in physics it has been abandoned in favor of a different theory, general relativity. The same thing holds here. The old conception of capital as a factor would exclude reswitching. Reswitching is possible. This means the treatment of capital as a single factor misunderstands the nature of production. We must re-examine radically from scratch. Indeed, we need another theory of investment. Then it's enough to turn to what empirical evidence shows. Empirical evidence is unable to confirm a significant influence on the rate of interest on investment. On the contrary, it strongly confirms that investment depends on expected growth of demand and on innovations. Then we can accept that savings adjust to investment, as Keynes argued, via changes of total output. Employment will depend on aggregate demand. Very importantly, the supply side neoclassical view of growth comes out to be radically wrong. And here a little addition. Now, without the neoclassical blinkers that prevent us from seeing what reality is like, we can pay the attention it deserves to the fact that capacity utilization is highly variable. I mean, empirical inquiries show that firms generally produce only about 80% of what they themselves would consider full production, where full production means what they would be happy to produce. So, an increase in aggregate demand by 20% will be satisfied by firms. And an increase by aggregate production of 20% is an enormous increase. Generally, you do not have these things. But this means more demand will stimulate more production. This is made possible by utilizing fixed capital for more hours and by running down inventories. These are initially run down when there is an unexpected increase of demand, but then there is increased production of the firms which produce those goods which have formed the inventories. And so this increased production reconstitutes the inventories. So in order to grow faster, there is no need to reduce consumption or wages. It is possible to have both more investment and more consumption. Now, why does the mainstream totally neglect these arguments? Well, there is first of all a strong desire to reject more critical views of capitalism. Already immediately after Ricardo's death, his theory was rejected because it was undermining the solidarity between social classes, because Ricardo was honest. He was saying that the interests of the different classes are in fact one against the other. But besides this, the main reason is an incomprehension by the neoclassicals of their own theory. The argument was, often now in bad faith, that neo-Varrasian general equilibrium theory saves the traditional marginalist picture. And because this neo-Varrasian general equilibrium theory produces anyway full employment and growth determined by savings, then why not use Solow's growth model, which has full employment and savings determining investment and income distribution determining marginal products? But all this, I argued, is totally rubbish, because general equilibrium theory tells us nothing about how real economies function, because it is unable to deal with disequilibrium. It is unable to be determined even. It is unable to justify the full employment. But during the Cambridge debates, the clarifications arrived late, when the neoclassicals had already decided that general equilibrium was the response to this criticism of the notion of capital. So the misunderstandings hardened before the clarifications arrived. The effect is now a refusal to study the arguments of the critics. The reaction to this must be, I think, to treat mainstream theory with only contempt and ridicule. The mainstream theory is based on treating capital as a factor. I mean, all macro models, in fact, use capital as a single good, in spite of the universal admission that this is illegitimate. And then it is argued that anyway, these single good models are justified by the fact that they are similar to general equilibrium growth paths. But this is laughable because, as I said, general equilibrium theory tells us nothing at all on actual economy. So we are living a bluff, maintained by a conspiracy of exclusion against anyone saying that the emperor is naked, or rather, that there is no emperor at all, since intertemporal equilibria do not exist. So, my last slide. It is time to stop being intimidated by mainstream theory. Scientific rigor requires expressing contempt and accusations of incompetence toward anyone who keeps treating capital as a factor and keeps pretending that general equilibrium is the micro foundation of mainstream macro models. On the contrary, on the other side, just the opposite, there should be no hesitation to admitting the vast room for radical policies, only needing a sufficient political will. Unemployment can be reduced by public policy that stimulates aggregate demand with no need to reduce wages. If governments do not do it, the reason is political. A battle for the minds of people can, we hope, persuade them to support government's intent on raising employment, and we can perhaps persuade them that the neoclassical objections to such expansive policies are wrong. As to inflation, the big scarecrow now, there is an institutional solution. Neo-corporatism, accords between government, trade unions, and firms, plus public firms in strategic industries with the task of not raising prices and thus blocking private firms from raising prices. And with this, I am finished, and I thank you for your attention, and I beg for your pardon for having taken so much time. I'm very sorry that my camera seems to keep not working.
Fabio, can you hear me? I cannot hear you. But don't know where is my problem.
I cannot hear either. Sergio, I'm not sure you're listening to me, but Fabio is mute.
Hello?
Hey, yes.
Good now? Yeah.
Yeah? A simple solution. Just turn it on. Okay. I have questions for both. Thank you very much for your presentation. I will start with Sergio. Sergio, thank you very much for your interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I will make two questions for you. The first one is the following. I wonder if there is a place for political science in the institutional and historical interdisciplinary studies envisaged by your paper. In particular, state theory and the investigation of economic and non-economic power relations seem to be topics that should be addressed in this respect. What is your opinion on this?
Can you hear me?
I can. Yes, Fabio. I can. Yes, we can. Are you hearing me? Hearing me? Okay. The second question for Sergio. Your discussion in the paper deals mainly with examples concerning pre-capitalist societies. I wonder whether you have another work or plans to apply your Zraffa, Marx, Polanyi synthesis to study modern capitalist societies. Is this included in your research program on the subject? Can you tell us a little bit more about your research program? Oh, this is the questions for Sergio. Should I make the questions for Fabio? Okay, Fabio. Now, two questions for you. First of all, thank you also for your clear presentation of very complex, intricate theoretical issues. And my first question concerns neoclassical trade theory. Neoclassical trade theory is an important component of the neoliberal approach to development economics. I wonder if you have some thoughts to share with us on the implications of the capital critique to the body of theory, to this body of theory, and if it can affect its presumption in favor of free trade policies. The other question is, I think that is better. You signalize in your presentation that you want to talk a little bit more about the relationship between investment and saving in intertemporal models. Can you tell us more about this relationship in intertemporal models, general equilibrium models, the investment in saving relationship? This is the questions. Thank you very much. These are the questions.
Okay, I suppose I'm the first to answer. Thanks, Fabio. We'll be very brief because we have been very long and perhaps a bit boring, at least myself. Hope not. Of course, first question, state theory. Of course, the state is by definition, is the most important institution. So, what is very interesting that the archaeological and anthropological literature, the born of the state is very carefully investigated from the early forms of state, and the state is born in more complex society as a way to manage the surplus. The first forms of state are redistributive tributary states, tax collecting state and redistributing the surplus, collecting it and redistributing it. So is that the Mesopotamian, early Mesopotamian economies are managed economies, as both Marx and Polanyi argued. So Polanyi implicit, I mean, Polanyi many times is a Marx without a surplus theory. So I mean, it's a emasculated Marx. Sorry for the Polanyians. So anyway, so state theory is really the center of these studies. And no, I mean, I'm not working. My main concern of my research are pre-capitalist societies. Of course, a lot would apply to capitalism. I mean, in capital, I mean, ancient, not pre-capitalist economic form has disappeared. I mean, the redistributive tributary state survived as a welfare state, for instance, in a modern society. So, I mean, you have forms of sharing economies, etc. As you could find markets in early societies. So, I mean, there are dominant forms, probably, as Marx taught. So, well, my research project is a very complex project, and I'm rather alone in this field. Not easy to find people that would help you, and so I hope to. So this is also a call for participation to this project. I mean, there is a lot of work to do, and some I'm doing. At a point, I'm a very curious person, so at a point I will stop and do something else. Thank you again. I'll stop here.
Zalt. Is back?
Yes.
Is back? Okay. Franklin. Thank you, Sergio.
Franklin, would like your presence here because you can hear me? No? Can you hear me?
No, I just don't know what I should do.
No.
Not in the program.
No. Of course, you can make another comment, but we are running out of time. In fact, we are time's up, and unfortunately, Professor Petri lost his connection, so
Okay.
that's the problem. We will not have answers for Fabio's questions, but since we are already run out of time, I think it's fair to finish this session. Of course, once again, I have to thank you very much, Sergio, for your presentation. You know that we have the same concerns. We think I'm working on things that are very similar to Sergio. No, as always, Sergio is very ahead of my work, and unfortunately, Sergio has this problem. Always writing better papers than me, and faster, and it's faster and better. It's like those Hollywood heroes. And Professor Petri also has amazing presentation. That's very, very, very complicated issues. He made like clear, so to speak, because they are really complicated. But I urge people, the students that are here, please check the link, check the YouTube presentation. They will be there for a long time. So it's stuff that you may not understand, like re-read, re-listen to stuff that Professor Petri presented in this talk. So we have. Oh, sorry.
Deixa eu só fazer uma pequena observação. Quem achou interessante a palestra do Petri, tem meu curso de Teoria do Valor na pós, que deve começar em setembro. Se tiver alguém aí do PPGE quiser se matricular, fazer uma pequena propaganda aqui. E a gente usa o livro dele.
Yes, I use his book once, chapter 2. So everybody's. So I thank you very much once again, Sergio. Thank you very much, Professor Petri. Thank you very much. And so we finish this session. And everybody that's watching, thank you very much.
See you soon.
This time I didn't say anything stupid because I didn't say anything. So it was my best performance.
So yeah, please send comments, Franklin and others, and all the others. Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao, Sergio.
Ciao, ciao.